Gallery. See, yeah, trips. No, I just say for
Good morning. Let's call the meeting to order at 9 a.m. To anyone viewing, welcome to budget meeting number 1. I'll turn to Councillor Parker for adoption of the agenda.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Spencer, that the agenda is prepared for the council budget meeting of Wednesday, December 7th, 2022 be adopted.
Any questions, concerns? I'm not seeing any. Just note that our procedural bylaw does allow for motions to come onto the floor. They don't have to be notice of motions. We can debate motions during the budget process. And we'll call for the vote. All those in favor? No one opposed. That's carried. We would like to start this morning's meeting by expressing our gratitude and acknowledging the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples dating back countless generations. Personally, we are connecting today from Tillsonburg, Ontario, which is an area of significance for many Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Tillsonburg is located on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples and is covered by the Between the Lakes Treaty number 3 of 1792. As we gather on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples dating back countless generations, we acknowledge the Ashinnabek, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ottawandawan people, showing respect for the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. Disclosure of pecuniary interest. When seeing none, then we'll turn the meeting over to our Director of Finance.
Morning. Morning, Madam Mayor, Council. Sorry, Laura, have you sent that link? You have? No, I don't. Wondering if you could resend.
Maybe just for clarification too, when do you want to take questions? When you're done your presentation?
So in terms of a process, what I would suggest or recommend to council is that council can ask questions either throughout the presentation or at the end of the presentation, because there might be some material that we would cover in later slides and perhaps at the end of the presentation. And then as we go through the process in terms of following the agenda, in terms of the budget binder, the various tabs, that council can present and pass motions as we move through the budget process, so that if council reviews, let's say the corporate services department, that should council wish to make any changes within that department, that a resolution could be considered as we go through each department by department. And that way, all the resolutions related to any budget changes can be tracked in the minutes. And then as finance makes the adjustments, we can correspond that with the minutes of the agenda of the meeting.
Is everyone good with that? Perfect, thank you.
So just taking a second here to connect to the Zoom meeting to be able to share my screen. As I'm doing that, just wanted to take a moment to thank all staff who have worked on this budget. It has been a team effort across the board. And because this is the first time that we are presenting to council a 10-year capital and a 5-year operating, there was more work required this year than in prior years. And I must commend all staff for undertaking that challenge and working through the process. And I'll go through some of the process that we followed as I just share my screen 1 second.
Oh, thank you for bringing that forward. I too, on behalf of council, want to thank staff. It was a well-presented budget. And, I think everyone took into consideration the pressures that the community is facing with regards to inflation. So thank you very much for all the work.
So we'll start with the overall budget review. Again, just before we get into the details, not only all departmental staff, all managers, and also the finance team, Shane Serafincian in particular, kind of really quarterbacks all the technical and all the departmental interface with everything to do with the budget. It could not operate without his expertise and knowledge of the town's history and the systems knowledge as well. So with that, we'll start with the overall summary tax rate. Since even when staff put forth the original information to council in the binder, since then, the assessment numbers have come in. This is the year-end impact total numbers, given the change for 2022. And given that change, the tax rate has been lowered 2.77%. So that is what the budget today is being presented at, as a 2.77, which translates on the average home value of $237,000. They will see a $52.74 increase on the annual tax bill. And because that tax bill is divided into 4 quarterly installments, that's $13.18 on a quarterly installment, or 14 cents per day. What I'm showing in this slide is,
Madam Mayor, excuse me, could that slide be very easily printed at this point so I can have that to reflect back to that slide right there, the change, please? Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
all of the slides that I'm presenting in the agenda package that went out to council yesterday, it is in the updated presentation within that PDF. Yes. So that was one of the, just to council. So what went out into the agenda is a copy of what was presented in the binder, with the exception of an updated presentation, just given some of the latest numbers from MPAC, and as well as during the council orientation, council had asked that some of the points that I had raised during the orientation be provided to council, and I've tried to incorporate some of that data into an updated presentation that is part of the package that went out. So that is available to the public based on the agenda package released on Monday. So in this slide, what I try to show is how we get to the 2.77, just for the public or just for general awareness, is that we take the overall levy divided by the weighted assessment. And the weighted assessment is what has really changed quite a bit in the in 2022. It's increased, so we're over $2 billion now in terms of the raw assessment. When that's weighted, if you take the raw times the tax ratios, we're seeing now weighted assessment of $2.3 billion. Hence, that's the reason why the tax rates, while we're seeing an 8.79 levy increase, the tax rate is down to 2.77. We have asked MPAC to come before council. MPAC offers a sort of municipal 101 presentation, and that is being scheduled for the January 24th meeting. So we'll get into more deeper details in terms of the assessment and the change as to the growth that the town has received, is experiencing, and MPAC will present that information. So that's the tax rate on the levy, which is the amount of money that the town, we look at the total expenditures less all other revenues that come into the organization. And the balance is what we need to raise through taxation. So that is a $19.1 million levy for 23, which represents an 8.79% change. We've broken down the 8.79 into both the operating budget, which is 4.47% levy change. That's inclusive of external requests, which amount to just over 1%. And we've broken that down into the BIA MOU. There's also a capital expenditure and the facility improvement total cost. So it's about 0.5%. The Station Arts MOU, about 0.25%. Community grants budgeted at 51.8. Well, the requests can come in higher than that, but that's what town has historically set as a budget. And then there is a request of 80,000 on the Bridge Street reimagining, which is currently coming out of reserves, but so just so there's a 0% impact to the levy, but we're highlighting it. There's still money out of reserves that could be redeployed in other areas to, if council wanted to lower the levy. So we have a net internal, what internal departments can control of 3.41% on the levy. The capital levy is 4.32%. And as we will go through this morning, that is to look at addressing the capital infrastructure requirements. And 2023, we're presenting a 4.3%, and then we're making additional recommendations in terms of the future years. So in summary, internal operating 3.41, the capital is 4.32. So total 7.73, what staff can control, less plus the external 1.06, we get the net town levy 8.79. So again, the budget development, the process that we followed this year, similar to previous years, except some minor adjustments in terms of working with developing the multi-year framework. Between June and August is when finance worked with all the departments to assist departments in their department submissions. In September, then finance does a review together with the departments, just confirming all the information, plus any interfunctional transfers, adjustments that finance has to make. Then in October, that's when we review the budget with SLT. And just to highlight, we also spent, there was a full day engagement with the CAO, the Director of Finance, Deputy Treasurer, together with each director, where we went through each budget. The primary focus was on what was changing in the budget at a high level in terms of the impact of the levy. So we looked at the operating plus the 10-year capital focus. So you can see there on the screen, the budget goes through various versions. And so we're now at council review. And so when departments submitted their budget, it was sitting at 12.91% levy increase. And through the work through those versions and the work between finance, CAO, and managers. But we presented now the 8.79. So staff internally have reduced the budget from the initial submission of about 724,000 is what we've removed, or about 4.12%. So there's been quite a great amount of work, and I feel that what we're presenting is a responsible budget in terms of addressing some of the capital needs, together with some of the cost pressures that organizations faced in today's economy. So we look at council in 2021 adopted the community strategic plan. And of course, the budget is basically a numerical representation of the activities that the town undertakes. And a lot of those projects are determined what the priorities set by council through the community strategic plan. So there are 5 pillars within the plan, 36 strategic directions, 49 priority projects. And there are 7 of those that relate to the financial status of the organization. So developing a robust long-term asset management plan to inform evidence-based decisions regarding the maintenance, rehabilitation, and replacement of municipal infrastructure. And as part of this presentation, this is the overall general overview. We then have also a presentation for council on asset management tied to the capital budget and how the asset management work to date has informed the capital budget and the work that still lays before us. One of those strategic projects is also enhancing employee engagement and training. We're focused on exceptional customer service across the entire organization. And again, when we look at the operating and capital, how do we maintain that? Council has said we want to position Tillsonburg as a leader in the municipal sector, and we can demonstrate in some areas where we're looking at doing that. The multi-year budget framework, financial sustainability plan, looking at municipal service reviews. All these are all things that are underway, and some have occurred. Boundary expansion initiatives, planning and developing a long-term financing strategy, and then replenishing and growing municipal reserves. So all of those within that overall framework is, when we were reviewing the budget, is how does the budget allow us to continue to meet those strategic goals. Overall, high level, the operating budget. So when we said 4.47 of the overall budget, we can see total net levy on the operating is 16.6 million. Wanted to highlight at a high level in terms of the broad categories of expenditures of labor. So overall, it's almost $35 million budget, 11.9 of which. So we show expenditures in terms of on the levy, labor purchases 5.8 million, contracted services 6.5, contributions to reserves, and then some adjustments and principal and interest on the debt. So on the operating side, $27 million total expenditures, less than 10.6 on the revenues. We can see some revenues. Grants are down. That's partly due to grants that in 2021, province increased the number of grants related to COVID recovery assistance. And so user charges, that's also another area we can see in 23. We are budgeting for some increases in user charges, other revenues, and then contributions from reserves is also increasing. So just high level on the capital budget, we can see an increase there of overall 4.31 on the levy, which again, the 2.5 million is almost a $760,000 increase over last year in terms of what was being contributed to the capital budget. and we'll get into more details later on, but overall, we can see just general increases. The largest one probably under facilities, $485,000 increase in facilities. We can see in parks as well. Streetlights is a new one this year. Those when we're working through the capital budget, we were also trying to identify areas where in the past there may not have been dollars set aside for certain capital projects. So we've tried to look at that. And then in public works, we can see a bit of shifting of some funds from roads and bridges over to storm. So $2.5 million capital levy. Wanted to show the revenue breakdown as well. Again, just looking at high level, $34.9 million total budget expenditure. That does not include the roughly $4.5 or $5 million that actually flows through the town for water and sewer and hydro. Because on a net basis, that does not impact our levy because water and sewer is paid for by the county, but we operate those systems. So all of the activity, all of the accounts payable, all of the staffing, all of the transactions, all the customer inquiries, all of that flows through the town. So in essence, our budget is more around 40 million, which reflects the truer level of activity. But because those budgets are fully funded by the county, it doesn't reflect as a net on the budget. But just to recognize that those activities are supported by RIT, by finance, by HR, and so that has an impact on the rest of the budget. Again, overall, other revenues 15.8, which gives us the levy of 19.1. So in the chart, in the pie chart, just to show the operating levy, 48% of the total overall, plus the capital levy. So there's about 55% of our total revenues come from the levy taxation. And what we've seen last year when we looked at a revenue study to see where we sit vis-a-vis other areas within Southwestern Ontario, is that there are opportunities where we can look at other revenues such as user charges and trying to leverage as much grants as possible to lower the reliance on the operating budget, on the operating levy and capital levy as much as we can. So it's just some overall budget pressures. We all know the current state of the economy, inflationary costs. What we've seen in 2022, we had a number of our RFPs and RFTs that came in over what we budgeted, some in 20 to 30% range. Our insurance at 15% renewal, that is still yet to be confirmed. Salary, overhead, and benefits, about 11.2. Just one note on the insurance, while we're highlighting it as a 15% increase, when we actually take a look at the budget last year, the actuals were actually lower than were budgeted. So on a net basis to the levy, it actually, the insurance has very little change, even though the renewal is coming in or is projected to come in around 15%. Also, what's new for OMERS, effective January 1st, OMERS has changed its rules in terms of non-full-time employees. They're now eligible to join OMERS at any time. Until now, they needed to achieve, I believe it was 700 or a certain number of hours over the 2-year period in order to become eligible. Now they're eligible right from day one. And so we have 35 eligible employees, which have until January to decide whether they wish to join. So we budgeted a 50% uptake of about 37,000. We've included in the budget, but depending on what transpires by January, We may have everyone wishing to join or less. So we just did a rough estimate of 50% uptake. There's also some legislative changes, as council is aware. So when we did the budget, we knew the Bill 23 was on the horizon. We did have presentations, but we didn't anticipate that it would receive royal assent so quickly. Therefore, we have not accounted for the changes from Bill 23 in the budget, and we'll attempt to do so before the end of January, before council adopts the budget. So a couple of things that jump out. The last development charges report and review, the DC legislation allowed for any master plans or overall just master plans, strategic plans, anything that allowed us to look at the future in terms of the growth. A lot of those plans could be paid for out of the DC reserve. Now that those are exempt. So whatever dollars we have in terms of studies that we were pulling out of those reserves, we may have to pull those out in terms of either not doing them or funding them from another source. So that's just some of the things that we'll take a look at and come back to council on that. And then, of course, again, with the capital levy going up almost 4.5%, capital program, just a number of projects on the go, and just the overall state of infrastructure. As council will see, we are looking at gaps in terms of the funding required to maintain our capital, our infrastructure in a state of, it's called good repair, to ensure that we can continue delivering services that the town citizens expect. And so there is a need there to look at some higher contributions to the overall capital program. So overall, in terms of some of the employer payroll costs, we can see overall there's about $173,000 in the payroll increases. And these are just some of the changes in terms of either the rates. As we can see, the rates, the owners' rates haven't changed. EI has gone up, CPP has gone up. But even when the rates don't change, because some of these are tied to the annual maximums, when the maximums go up, there's also an impact. And so sometimes we get both a rate increase and the maximums have increased, and therefore that generates additional requirements on the employers. In terms of CPI, so the budget does include inflationary cost drivers, both to labor and to other areas of the budget. When we took a look at developing the budget back in June, we were looking at what CPI was trending at that time. And we took a look at the past. Normally, when we took a look at what neighboring municipalities were doing with CPI, some just take if CPI was whatever number, say for July, that's the percentage that some of them have adopted. What some municipalities do, or I think quite a number of them, is they do the average of the past 12 months, because any 1 month is, and I've confirmed this with Stats Canada, if you take a look at just July's number, that's just the difference from this year's July to last year's July. So it's just a month over month kind of comparison from the prior year. To calculate what CPI is for the year, is you take the average of the previous 12 months. And that's what we've done. So at that time, July 21 to June 22, that number came in at 5.7. We also took a look at, in concert with what was happening with our tenders and RFPs and the cost drivers, because not everything goes up by CPI. CPI is a basket of goods, which includes things like fuel, bananas, other things, which the town doesn't necessarily buy everything in that basket of good. A lot of our programs, when we take a look at, for example, road salt, asphalt prices. Those are driven more by commodity prices and what crude oil, what a barrel is going up by. Part of the crude oil is what gets converted into creating the part of the mix of the asphalt. So those commodity prices have an impact on a lot of the cost drivers for some of our items. So when we take a look at CPI, all items amount to 5.7, but then it's also broken down. So we took a look at transportation, we took a look at gasoline, energy costs, or heat, hydro, all of those costs, services. And as a budget guidance for all managers, we provided this information, not necessarily that their budgets, they were to say increase the fuel prices for the fleet by 38.53%, but that it was a guide to take a look at what inflationary pricing looked like for that category and to look at whether we were experiencing those costs and to come up with a reasonable amount that we should budget for that would reflect our actual costs. So this was the budget guidance, and this is what's been included within the budget. And each manager or director will speak to some of those items as they go through the departmental budget. So in terms of some of the payroll change breakdown, so in terms of headcount versus FTEs, so this is just a breakdown by department and the FTEs for 22. And actually I did send out an updated table on this, which just shows that the number of FTEs is going up by like 1.2. And the reason why it took a little bit longer is because the calculations, they're in different areas of the budget, which we have to convert the dollars into hours, and that's how we get the full-time equivalents. Because full-time is if an employee works 40 hours a week, that's 2,080 hours a year. If you work 35 hours a week, it's 1,820. So we convert the hours into the full-time equivalent, and we have both positions that are both 40 hours and 35 hours. So we've done an approximation here based on 40 hours a week, which is the majority of what our employees work, noting that some positions are 35. So it's a best approximation. And so that's in terms of, again, bodies, because we have part-time and firefighters, we have 180 overall, say, bodies headcount, which converts to roughly 150 FTEs. Just in terms of the payroll change breakdown. So of the 583 change for full-time, we notice of the 583 that what the CPI amount totals is 281,000 of that, and for part-time about 35,000. The payroll overhead, that again, that's all the burden, CPP, EI, and all those other increases. The benefits, the increase related to the 1 FTE, 1.02 FTE increase is 45,400 in full-time. And the 62,000 in part-time. Then grid movements one time and any service level changes. So just a switch a bit in terms of the assessment. Again, we'll get into further details with MPAC, but we're showing what MPAC is showing as property counts. So it went up 2.5% in 22, or about 192 properties increased in 2022. The CVA, the current value assessment, so that's the total value of the assessment base, that's an increase of 5.07%. That is quite a substantial increase, represents over $100 million added to the assessment base, which again is now over $2 billion. The weighted assessment, we can see the How it breaks down, residential 73%, commercial is 15%, industrial is 7%, and multi-res 5%. So that is what the taxes are based on, is the weighted assessment breakdown. I thought it was interesting to also highlight just the change because of the growth the town has experienced. It depends where that growth is relative to the various different tax classes. So in 2016, residential was 71%, and 2022, it is 73%. So we've experienced a lot of growth, and a lot of that is in the residential. The commercial relative to the other classes has stayed at 15%, while the other, which is multi-res industrial, has actually decreased relative to the growth of residential. And just to highlight the left and the bottom, the 2022 base assessment, so that's the raw assessment. Once it gets weighted, which is again taking the raw assessment times the tax ratios, and I put the tax ratios there. Again, on the raw assessment, residential is 85%, but when you weigh it in terms of its value to base what the taxes are based on, it makes up 73% of the tax base. And likewise, we can see commercial, because the ratio of commercial is higher than residential. Residential is ratio of 1. That's what all the other classes are based on. Farmland is a quarter of that, or here it's 21.8%. Commercial being 1.9. So commercial, the raw assessment goes from 9% to 15%. So it has a greater contribution to the tax base. Commercial and industrial contribute higher than because of their ratios. And the ratios are determined by the county. Those are set at the upper tier, and they impact all lower tiers. In terms of the full year outlook, again, historically, the town has only looked at just a single year budget. In a multi-year budget framework, so what we're presenting is a 10-year capital and a 4-year operating. And while staff have looked at what those numbers would look like for the next 4 years, because it's the first year in doing so, obviously a greater focus has been on the 2023 budget, but as experience with the multi-year is gained, every year those numbers further out will get fine-tuned and better. So they are just a forecast. Council is only still adopting a 2023 budget. It's just those other years are forecasted just based on the data that we have currently and where the trends are. So it's not so much about, so we say accuracy, as much as trend analysis and looking at the trajectory of where the town is moving towards. So those numbers, obviously next year, the 2024 will change based on the revenue sources, the needs, or the grants are available at that time. So those will adjust. What we actually are showing and what we'll see as we go through the other presentation is that given the needs on the capital budget, we are making some recommendations to council in terms of having a dedicated capital levy of 3% for 24, 3% for 25, and then 1% for 26 onwards. And that will just allow for staff to know the funding envelope in terms of what they're working with to be able to address the infrastructure needs. And it provides a level of funding as we'll go through that reduces the amount of the gap that's been identified in our infrastructure requirements. So overall, again, we'll continue on with the other presentation, but just high level, what we've looked at is the 10-year funding. There is a facilities audit that was completed in 2022 that does show that's included in this chart to highlight what staff have looked at in terms of the 10-year forecast. So until now, the requirements at the provincial level in terms of our asset management plan has only required that we report on our core assets. So that's our linear assets, everything, roads, bridges, sewer, water, but again, the county reports on those. As of 2024, will be required to report on all assets that the town owns. So as part of all that effort that we'll need to undertake, the town did undertake a facilities audit that was completed in 2022. And just high level, this does show shows both the total expenditures without the facilities audit, and then with the facilities audit, what the recommendations were and how our funding levels will match up against the requirements. And as we can see, the gray line is total contributions on if council adopts the 2023 budget as presented, and then keeps that same amount going forward, or if council adopts the recommended 2023 levy number, and then the 3 and the 1% thereafter. That's the orange line. What that does to the numbers, vis-a-vis then the total expenditures. So in some areas, what we're presenting is the total expenditures without the facilities audit, because that number is quite high. The results of that audit was that the town would need to spend, it was recommended, we would need to spend $71 million over the next 25 years, which is about 40 million or so in the next 10 years. When we took a look at the budget, that kind of requirement would be, it's quite high. And so that's where I say we're presenting a responsible budget, because part of the work that needs to occur is that we now need to take all that data and we need to incorporate that into our asset management work and determine what a most effective program looks like for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So without that facilities audit data, this is what those charts would look like. And again, the gray line is if council were to adopt the recommendations, would put us on a more sustainable path. And again, one of the strategic goals the council has set is to look at a financial sustainability plan, which one of the components of that would be looking at the dedicated capital levy. Again, we'll get into more details in the next presentation. During the orientation, I also touched on the amount of debt that the town has and what the repayment limit is. So the ministry sets the limit the town, what the town can borrow. And for 2022, the numbers are actually generated from the 2020 FIR, which is the financial information return that the municipality is required to submit each year. So this is the 2020 data. And the limit is set at 25% of our net revenues. So that's what we ourselves raise minus provincial grants and some other interdepartmental transfers to arrive at a net. So 25% of net revenue, 5.4 million. And in 2020, our principal and interest costs were 1.9 million, or about 9% of the current limit. So we're just less than half. So 25% is the limit. We're at 9%. And what that means is, again, that's just principal and interest. That's not how much we borrow. If, just for example, if we could borrow at 5% or at 7% interest over 20 years at 5%, that means we could borrow another $43.7 million. Or at 7%, that would be 37.2. And what I just tried to show down at the bottom is the Infrastructure Ontario lending rates and what they've done over the last year. We can see the numbers obviously as the Bank of Canada has increased the overnight lending rates to tackle the inflation, which today actually it's expected that the bank will increase that again by a quarter or a half percentage point. We can see that as of June, I actually have received the December numbers. They're actually higher on the shorter term, actually lower in the longer term. We can see we will be around 4.5% if we were to borrow money for 10 years. At 30 years, again, above 4 is as of June, it was 4.76. And you can see in the 10-year, that's almost 2 percentage points higher in June than it was back in November. So our borrowing costs have also increased. In terms of our reserves, our 2022 year-end forecast, again, we're not finalized in 22 yet because we're still depending on the projects that were approved to be funded from reserves and what those actuals will come in at. So we're looking at overall reserve balance of about 7.3 million for 22 year end. Again, that's a forecast. And the forecast for 2023 will see a decrease down to 6 million. We break it down between the operating reserves and the capital. So the reserves that we know are earmarked for capital projects. So we can see this for 23, there is a drawdown of about $3 million in capital reserves. And again, that's to address some of the capital projects and the infrastructure needs. On the investment side, part of those funds are invested. And so we have estimated balance as of December 31st. Again, estimated because there's some interest costs and so forth that still need to be flowed through. And depending how much the reserves we are drawing out from, 6.4 million in investments. And we can see of the 1.3 million in the trust funds, the majority of that is made up by the cemetery trust. Those dollars are pretty much fixed at that amount, and we use the interest from that to do the perpetual care on the cemetery plots. So what council will see overall, the recommendations that we're proposing is what we've looked internally in terms of staff is that there needs to be a greater focus on our asset management program. We need to utilize and leverage our systems. We do have software, but we need to leverage those systems to provide management with key decision tools. There needs to be greater alignment of those systems to inform future budgets and to also meet regulatory compliance for 24, 25 and onwards. And we'll have slides later on as well to show what those compliance needs are. But the message is that if we just do the activities just to meet regulatory compliance, we have not adopted the spirit of what asset management is all about, which is really to look at how we can best manage our assets to ensure that they can sustainably deliver the services to the citizens and continue to do so for future generations. We also want to look at evaluating revenue options to diversify our revenue sources and reduce the reliance on property taxes. And one of those that we've started as the fee bylaw will come back to council at its next meeting. It'll take still some continued effort and work in terms of looking at some cost recovery efforts, but you'll see that council will see that a number of the rates have already started to adjust and to make some increases. And again, just an implementation of our what we call an infrastructure renewal program. We have a number of assets that were built back in the 50s, 60s, that are all coming due for replacement. And there just hasn't been enough money set aside to replenish those assets. And so in 23, part of that 4.3% capital levy increase is to address some of those ongoing capital needs. And then having a dedicated capital levy of 3% for 24, 25, and 1% onwards. And also to not only look at increasing the funding for it, but also looking at the total inventory of the infrastructure and looking at ways where we can rationalize the infrastructure. When we take a look at the capital needs, are there opportunities where we can consolidate, reduce the footprint and reduce the overall cost? Not just capital, but operating costs. And so what we'll show in the next presentation is that if adopted by 2030, again, looking at the 10-year forecast, without the facilities audit expenditure, because that is sort of a big sort of ticket item that will need to do some greater effort in terms of how that is addressed. But without that, with the dedicated capital levy over 10 years, the requirement for the capital spending would be reduced by 93%. And again, just to highlight overall bottom line, we are looking at a tax rate of 2.77 or about less than $53 per the average homeowner. So this is the end of the overall presentation for this presentation. And again, we'll follow up as well with a capital one and asset management that incorporates some of the directors presenting some aspects of their departmental as the asset managers. So just to highlight, to do a deeper dive in terms of the state of our infrastructure. But in terms of the overall general, are there any questions at this time?
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. I'll start and thank you for this. Throughout all the years that I've been sitting through budgets, nothing is more clear and precise and easy to read than what you've presented, and I thank you for that. Particularly the asset management portion of what you just presented, because in the past, we've seen a number, we're really not aware of how important asset management programs are in the future. And another thing too, the debt. We looked at the debt which you presented here, and over the past several years, that keeps reducing, and it's been much, much higher, and the overall debt for the town. And that's commendable to staff to make sure that that's an important number to reduce, especially at these interest rates with more coming again, maybe today. So I do have a question on the asset management portion. Sometimes, not sometimes, I'm sorry, all the time, the province grades us on our asset management program on how much, how organized we really are for the future for the town. When we knock on doors for the province for grants, I'm sure this has a great deal of effect. So we'll ask for something, and because we have one form of taxation, that's property tax, and the residents of Tillsonburg are paying a lot of other taxes, HST, et cetera, alcohol, gas tax. And we want some of that back. That's our money originally, and we're entitled to it, but we have to be set up for that. So the asset management program, in my opinion, is the way to get that back. Do you think, I'm wondering if it's enough of what you're presenting here? Because if we contribute more, does that mean we're more close to the top of the pecking order to get some of these grants back for some of the things we need, infrastructure changes for industrial parks, for example? That's up and coming. We just saw the notice of Cami yesterday or the day before, when the Prime Minister and the Premier were talking about the $2 billion investment in Oxford County. And I'm sure if we're sharp, we'll be able to get some of the spin-off of that because we're so close logistically. So I'm just concerned, and I know we don't want to tap the taxpayer too hard here, but do we feel that this asset management for year one, which you're proposing here, even though it's a 10-year program, do you think it's enough? Or let me rephrase that. How important would it be if we were to increase that number in terms of getting dollars back from provincial grants for our needs?
Thank you for the question. I do have some slides in the capital asset management presentation that will speak to that. Overall, I believe, yes, when we submit our information, both the FIR and the asset management plan to the province, they do review that. And even though it's not made necessarily public in terms of their decision-making when we apply for funding, I do believe that it does have an impact. And specifically with OSIF funding, there's a change in the legislation where beginning in 2023, the amount that we will receive in OSIF will be based on the replacement values that are determined in our asset management plan. And so if we do not have an up-to-date asset management plan that truly reflects what the cost is to replace our infrastructure, we may be losing out on some funding. Mind you, they have set a cap of 15% year over year so that there's enough dollars in the pool for all municipalities. But in order for us to be able to receive the maximum, we will need to have good data, proper data, accurate data, and full costing of our asset replacement, because those values will become important.
So that really depends then on the value or the audit of what our assets are worth, is what you're saying here.
Yes. In 2009, when PSUB 3150 was mandated on municipalities, that's when our financial statements needed to disclose all the value of everything that the town owns, all assets. So we now need to, while we're disclosing what we've been disclosing, what we felt at the time was what we feel is the total value, we do need to undertake a greater effort to really look at all that information, ensure that it's as accurate as possible. And we need to integrate that into our asset management systems and align those with our budgeting systems as well. So yes, it definitely has an impact. And I will show, there's some slides again. I will speak further to this in the next presentation.
Anyone else? Counselor Parsons?
Thank you, Mayor. There is a mention here of the facilities review. I just wondered, does council have a copy of that facilities review? Would that be the previous council? I don't think I've seen that document.
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody in council have a facilities review?
Yes.
Through the chair, so.
It was part of the orientation package. So in your appendix, it listed and it was on your thumb drive. It's about 150 pages long. So. Pardon me?
2,500,
2,500.
pages.
So it's on the thumb drive.
It's all right. Thank you. I wondered, there's a lot of documents on there. I kind of wish I had seen that a little bit before this meeting, but I too want to thank you for a very good presentation and through you to all the departments for all the hard work that you've done. And it's pretty easy to follow. I just have one other question. You mentioned, I believe, Mr. Pugliese, that our user, our operations budget, the operating budget, is funded 55% through taxation and only a small portion through user fees, and that there are other municipalities doing things that are different than we are, perhaps. Can you share how close we are to that? What needs to happen for us to reduce operating fees from taxation and increase user fees, other sources of revenue? Is that something you can share at this point, or just as a guideline?
Yes, well, just some high level. There is a revenue study that we did commission last year. We can definitely raise that and share that with council. It just provided some ideas to allow us to brainstorm potential options that we could look at how we could diversify our revenues. So they also did take a look at the average within Southwestern Ontario and what those fee structures relative to the taxation portion. And the average within Southwestern Ontario is around 45, say, to 50% in terms of their property taxes. So we have about 5 to 10% room there, I think, where we can look at additional revenues. So we have started that, but that's going to take a little bit of time. So for example, I know, and Julie can maybe better speak to that, but for example, they've looked at of the user fees that come in through our recreation programs, how many of those are based on town residents versus outside the town residents? And there is it 30% of our collections that we receive, or the fees collected, come from non-residents. So are there opportunities where we're providing services to non-residents, which it happens in every municipality. There is cross service provided based on the geography and where the users of those facilities come in. So we're looking at whether there's opportunities there to have conversations with our neighboring municipalities, whether they'd be open to any kind of contributions towards some of our capital facilities, or whether we have separate fee structure that a non-resident would pay a higher amount than a resident. So those are all things that that's what I mean by evaluating revenue options, is we'll need to take a look at those structures and see where those opportunities may lie and bring those back to council for as recommendations.
Thank you. And just additional to that, I look forward to getting that information, that report, whenever it can be available. But as we look at today's budget, we see, for example, some activities, airport, transit, where user fees are not even close to our expenses to operate, operate those activities. And so I'd be anxious to know what options exist for us to try to reduce our expenses through perhaps a review of the user fees. And thank you for the answer.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? I could suggest that council can speak by resolution if they wanted to look at changing any of the fees. And I think the fees will be coming back because that was deferred, right? So that's maybe a conversation for when the fees come back later on. I think we should have a resolution to receive the budget overview as information. Would anybody like to move that? Councillor Parker?
By
Seconder?
myself, seconded by Councillor Parsons, that the budget review or budget overview report be received as information.
Questions? No? All in favor? It's carried, no opposed. So I guess you can continue. We're moving on to the asset management capital budget review, which is starting on page 25 of the agenda.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just taking a moment to bring that up and Okay, so again, just having been with the town for a year, it was my understanding that as part of the budget presentation, that there wasn't an accompanying asset management presentation. And we felt that this year, given that we're presenting a 10-year capital budget, that it would be prudent for council to hear from staff about some of the information that we do have when it comes to the state of the infrastructure overall, and some of the impacts in terms of how the asset management work that we have done informs the 10-year capital, and how it's all really interconnected with our strategic plan and all the other activities that the town wishes to undertake. So again, for this one, I do want to thank all directors and managers because again, being the first year in developing 10 years worth of data, while some departments did have that in their various spreadsheets, we asked them to really bring that into a more specific format, which is part of the budget binders, all the 10-year spreadsheets. And it took quite a bit of work, a lot of back and forth to work through that data. So this is just, again, high-level overview. We do have some examples that different directors will speak to, a couple of slides from each area to really focus on why we're making the recommendations that we are doing overall. So just again, overall, the capital levy that we're presenting is 2.5 million. But just to recognize, and I'm sorry if the print is small, on the bottom right, taxation at 2.508, that's the tax amount. There is obviously other revenues. The overall expenditures is 5.7 million in terms of the 23 capital program. Plus, we have 331,000 that's being levied. That's as a contribution to their capital reserves. And just a note on that. So transfers to reserves can happen in one of two ways, either from your operating department, where you are charging out costs to other departments, could be, and so those recoveries, portion of that could be for future capital replacement. So a portion of that is to cover the expenses, plus a component would be transferred to a capital reserve, or in the capital levy itself, we levy an amount that is automatically transferred to some reserves. And so then we'll see $622,000 in grants, 507,000 in tax supported debt. So normally in terms of debt, that is what the town has traditionally, I'm told, if we pay down roughly about $1 million worth of principal and interest, that the town would normally levy or take out additional debt. We could utilize that $1 million of additional debt. And in this year, we're only utilizing 500,000 of that historical practice, reserves of 1.3 million. And then again, the DC reserves of 735,000, which again will have to be reviewed in terms of the new legislation. Over the 10 years, we showed total capital expenditures of about $71 million. So that's just given the current data that the town has. And just to comment, so if we take a look at the left-hand side, so this is all the asset classes. So the capital budget was developed not necessarily by department, but by asset class, which follows what really asset management and the whole format, which is looking at the total inventory and how it's broken down by various assets. So fleet as an asset class, roads, storm, streetlights, facilities. So it's not so much, for example, in fire, there's a fire hall, but it's not really the responsibility of the fire chief to manage the fire hall. It would be our facilities managers that manage that infrastructure. Same with fleet. Basically, the town, in essence, sort of owns the assets. The departments rent from the town. The town is sort of the landlord, and we have dedicated asset managers that look after those assets. That's generally the theory. If we incorporate the facilities audit data, again, we felt that this was too much to take on in 1 year, plus more work needs to be done to really evaluate all that data in terms of how it really integrates with our overall capital program. But I just highlighted, if we integrate that, we really would be looking at spending $114 million over the next 10 years as what's projected in terms of the capital program. So if we take a look at, that's the expenditures, and then if we take a look at what currently, where our base is in terms of the levy and currently any other revenues, because it's not just levy, right? As we saw, if I can go back 2 slides, there's a taxation component, but then we also have other revenues such as debt, reserves, grants that flow into the capital program. One of the things to note is that we have really looked at, and again, this is when we're taking a look at 10 years, staff were able to develop really 10 years worth of expenditures. But in terms of identifying those additional revenue sources, we know, for example, that we have the federal gas tax, and that's a commitment the federal government has made. So we were able to track that. OSIF, we're assuming that it's going to be there for the next 10 years. Although again, we will need to take a look at how that's going to be impacted by the replacement values and changes to that figure. But right now, we've just maintained that the same. In terms of the DC charges, in the next few years, where projects that are linked to some of our what's currently in the DC study. So in terms of other revenues, other than the levy, it's really only the next few years that have really been identified. The other years are more for forecast. And again, there needs to be more work every year to fine tune the data, both on the expenditure and the revenue side. But for a first year effort, this is what's been presented so far. And again, so if we have $114 million of total expenditures over the next 10 years, we take a look at what we currently could forecast, the levy plus other revenues. And it is based on the 2023, if council were to adopt the 2023 level of capital funding, over the next 10 years, it'd be $48.7 million against the 114 million or the 71 million total expenditure. So we can see the gap. So then what I'm showing in the bottom table is if council were to adopt the 2023 capital levy plus the 3% and then the 3 for 24, 25 plus the 1 for 26 onwards, if we plug that number in and stretch those out, then our total contributions in would be about 69.5 million. So that would be an increase of almost $21 million. And so what we mean by in terms of the total expenditures, just to highlight, for example, in bridges and culvert. So we can see the transfers. And so this spreadsheet, all spreadsheets, just to kind of highlight for council, the makeup of this spreadsheet is that it looks at if there's an opening balance in terms of a reserve that's dedicated for this asset class. So we would start with that number. And then what is the amount coming in from the capital levy and any other funding sources? So for bridges and culverts, for example, for 23, we do have a reserve that has $693,000. There's $55,000 that's earmarked coming in from the capital levy. And there's debenture funding of 1.2 million. So we have total available for projects of 1.9, and we can see total capital projects of 1.2 million. And so our closing balance would be 757,000. That gets carried over to the next year and so on and so on. And we can see that the capital levy, even when we factor in the 3% and the 3 and the 1, and so we can see from 23, the capital levy goes from 55,000 to 2032 to 127,000. Given the number of projects identified for bridges and culverts that need to be replaced over the next 10 years, we can see there's still quite a gap in bridges and culverts. Now, what we've done is when we had to calculate the extra revenues coming in from the 3 and the 1%, so that's generating X number of dollars, which have been distributed across the various asset classes by the relative proportion to the 2023 levy amounts. So one of the tasks still before us would be to actually look at what that impact is across the board and ways on how we can actually divert the funds to the proper asset classes that have the greatest need. So you'll see in your spreadsheets in the binder, some with if council were to adopt the dedicated levy, some are fully in the black now, while some are still in the red. And so it would be a matter of diverting those funds. We just didn't do that because obviously this is just a scenario based if council adopts that the dedicated capital requirement. And so Bridges and culvert, again, based on what the levy is for 2023, even if we were to increase by those relative percentages, we can still see there's greater requirements. So over 10 years, $13 million of expenditures against 4.6 million of total available funding. Again, there's other areas where there's opportunities to redivert the funds to this this asset class. So when we take a look overall, again, high level over 10 years, funding versus the expenditures. So again, total expenditures, 71 million. If we include the facilities audit data, that's 114 million. Total contributions using 2023, if council adopts the 2023 capital levy, that would generate 48.7 million. If council approves the 23 base plus the 3%, and then the one thereafter, that would bring it to 69 million. And the next line down below, which says full revenue, that's if we were to try and bring up the levy requirements, similar to what was the question that was posed, to try and meet the 114 million requirements. That would mean we would have to look at bringing total funding to a level above 14.3 million to be able to allow us to do all that work that is designated for 2028. So we can see the chart below, what the extra funding required to be able to achieve all of the current projects identified over the next 10 years. So funding versus expenditure. So what we're again presenting in terms of dedicated capital levy, that would allow us, we were looking at the total expenditures of 71 million. If council only adopts the 4.3 for 2023 and just stays at that level, that was still, if you look to the right side of the second table, the $22.3 million is the shortfall over 10 years. And if council adopts the 23 capital levy plus the 3 and the 1, and then keeps to the 1% dedicated for the rest of the 10 years, that brings in 69.5 million for a gap of 1.6. And so the difference from 22 million to 1.5 is a reduction of 93%. Hence why we are putting forth the recommendation that we are. Again, that still does not address the facilities audit. And again, it's only the next few years that show other funding sources. And so just as a trend forecast, again, every year, more work needs to occur and staff will keep refining the data as we go along. For the first year of the township putting forth a 10-year capital program, again, this is what the numbers we have. And hence why we feel what we've recommended is given the growth the town has experienced, to bring in a tax rate of now 2.77, that we feel this is a responsible budget to at least bring the level up of funding to a more sustainable level. So now we get on to a little bit of the asset management side, where we do a little bit of some drill down just to, we felt it was important that council has a little bit of a view in terms of the state of our infrastructure and how this information really informs the capital budget, and it's really part of the integrated planning. So as council is aware, in terms of integrated planning, so the official plan that for the town is normally looks at a 20-year focus in terms of the data forecast, population growth, and so forth. And it's the official plan that really determines the land use policies. The town has a 10-year strategic plan and now has a 10-year capital plan. And where all these plans really need to start intersecting because it is the official plan that determines, again, the land use policies, which determines how the town will use the land, how much of it is going to be residential, how much is commercial, industrial, which indirectly determines really the type of infrastructure we require, and also the type of revenues that we will generate from those tax classes. So that's really a high-level document that does impact the overall town services that the town needs to deliver, the revenues it will bring in, and type of infrastructure that the town will be having to develop and maintain. So tied that to the strategic plan, which looks at the services that the town wishes to deliver overall and the goals it wishes to meet. Tied to the capital plan, which is how do we maintain all the existing assets that we currently have, and looks at a strategy in terms of how we can better inform the budget to how we're going to deliver on all of these requirements. And then the strategic plan also has a requirement for a long-term financial plan, which is the financial plan includes things such as your revenue policy in terms of how you would diversify the revenue sources, your debt policy, surplus policy, financing policies, all those policies that determine then the long range, what the financial status is of the organization, that all feeds into the budget. And so your budget really is sort of the bottom line. Again, it's when council adopts a budget, council is really adopting also the necessary service levels and the contributions to those services that the town is going to deliver. So it's really asset management is an important component of an integrated planning framework that, as the town looks at its multi-year, really taking a focus on really multi-year thinking as well in terms of decision making and how today's decisions impact the long-term viability of the town. So in terms of from the provincial side, again, we talked about PSAB. That was in 2009 is when municipalities needed to report on their assets. In 2012, the province released a guide for municipalities. And in that guide, they spoke about which sort of this chart really also speaks. This is about the public, net public stock, so what the province owns, but it's also representative of that at the municipal level, just really representing that a lot of our infrastructure that was put into the ground and above ground in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was the era of expansion, if you will, post-war expansion. And then, of course, once all that was built, then there was actually no contribution, or it wasn't recognized in the whole public sector that funds needed to be set aside to eventually replace those assets. And so that's where we see the negative investments. And then the recognition starting in 2000 onwards, again, from the federal and provincial levels, that there needed to be now a lot of these assets who are 50, 60 years old were coming due for replacement. And then that's when PSAB came along with municipalities to also say, as a level of government, you own these assets, you also now need to start setting money aside. And so what that guide spoke about was about developing a comprehensive asset management plan, recognizing that there needed to be more work that the municipalities, the federal government, and the provincial government really needed to do together to really address the capital needs. And that the first step that the province was looking at was requiring any municipality, so this is in the 2012 guide, that any municipality seeking provincial capital funding needed to prepare an asset management plan and show how its proposed project fits within that plan. So again, it speaks to the importance of it. And as part of that process, they highlighted then the municipalities will need to demonstrate how they themselves are assisting financially with the project, including engaging with Infrastructure Ontario. So at the time, there were a number of municipalities that had a zero debt policy, and the province recognized that will step up, come to the table, but we also needed to do our part. And that is taking on debt as a strategy, as a lever in terms of how we would address our capital needs. So in essence, there were a number of municipalities that were going to the province saying, give us more money because we don't have the money to take care of our assets. And the province looked at that and said, well, as a sector, we always tell the province that we are a mature level of government. Don't prescribe things, don't tell us how to do things. And yet we kept going back saying, oh, but give us more money, give us more money. So the province finally said, well, okay, we'll help you, but you need to help yourself. So again, this is part of the work, and what we're laying out is the continued efforts that the town will build on the past asset management efforts, but a greater effort in terms of moving forward. And I think by demonstrating that, then the province, I think, will be more positively in favor or in terms of response, in terms of some of the provincial funding. And again, now we start to see that in terms of the legislation, in terms of OSIF funding, that it will impact the information that we present in our asset management plan will impact some of the funding sources. What's included in the asset management plan is obviously there's four main things. Obviously, what's our state of local infrastructure? What do we own? Where is it? What condition it's in? And really, by now, the town really ought to have this information, and we will continue working on that to make sure that we have good data. Every foundation is good data is the foundation of making good decisions. Without that data, we can't make proper decisions. The expected levels of service. So what condition are we maintaining that infrastructure? How many cracks in the road is citizens willing to live with in terms of how much they wish to contribute to a particular service? So what levels of service? What's the strategy? How do we manage the infrastructure to achieve those optimal results? And then how are we going to pay for it? These are all the things that are, again, part of that integrated planning framework that need to be identified in the asset management plan. So when we take a look at the asset management strategies, one of the things, just to highlight again, this comes from the guide, is that what's been identified in terms of best practices or how we incorporate better long-range planning is that what's called poor asset management versus smart asset management. So this is, let's say, a road. This is the deterioration curve of, say, a road segment. And what's been found is that there are certain points in time in which if you do the right treatment to the right asset at the right time, you will maximize the overall return and spend less overall. So if at 14 years or so, or 13 years, you spend 10 million to bring that road back up to 100%, and you keep doing that, you can see that over time, you're spending less than if you let that road deteriorate right to the ground and then have to rebuild it from the ground up. And why this is important is because, as you'll see, if you noticed in your budget binder, the 10-year forecast for roads, every single project is a full reconstruction. So what this means is that every single road project over the next 10 years, that curve has hit the bottom. As if you remember in the tour, there was one spot where one of our managers so bravely said, all the assets on this street are dead. The road, the infrastructure, everything is, and so that's what this represents. So what we try to do in the overall 10-year capital is look at, if we only keep doing things by waiting to full reconstruction, we need to start having funds so that we can do better preventative treatment on the roads to be able to avert spending more money in the long run than we need to be. So this is just, again, based on the dollars. So as council can see, if we do a crack ceiling based on $2021, that's almost $2 per meter or square meter. If we do a partial depth, it's $33, full depth versus full reconstruction, it's $121 per square meter. Just so council just has a better idea in terms of by doing full reconstruction, it's costing us more money because we have not done the proper treatments historically at the right time to the right asset. Hence why, even though we're asking council to increase the capital levy, we believe it's wise investment because in the long run, the town will save money in the future rather than having to do the full reconstruction. And that applies across all asset classes. We need to have a certain funding level so that we can do the right treatments to the right time, to the right assets to prevent the assets deteriorating to a point where then it costs more money to do replacement. So looking in what.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you.
Sure.
Your presentation is great, but I think that will maybe take like about a 5-minute break or so.
Sure.
Okay.